The skies above Prospero were no longer a dome of calm sapphire and soft aurorae, but a torn tapestry stitched with dying suns and drifting ash. Once, light had poured from the heavens like a scholar's lamp over parchment, warming the marble libraries and glass-bright towers below. Now the light was fractured and trembling, as though the stars themselves recoiled from what had been wrought here. Every gust carried not only grit and embers, but the faint psychic echo of voices that had filled this world with music, learning, and dreams, now a hollow hum like a seashell pressed to the ear long after the ocean has gone. In the middle of what had been the great library stood a figure who, to legend, was a demigod, but in this moment looked more like a man who had read too many prophecies and found them all ending in grief. Magnus the Red did not stride or roar. He moved slowly, his crimson skin dulled by ash, his single golden eye scanning shelves that no longer held books but cracked fragments of thoughtstone. A savant among ruins, he traced the spines of vanished knowledge with a clawed fingertip, as if by touch alone he might stitch the past back together. The weight of secrecy bent his shoulders more than any battle ever had. Beyond Prospero, a galaxy stretched in silent majesty, armies marching on 1,000 worlds, starships burning trails through the void. But here, in this quiet, there was only the warp's tremor, a pulse of foreboding like a drum heard underwater. The narrator's voice draws close, softer than the drifting ash, to speak not only of this world, but of yours. We truly love and care for you. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Magnus raised his head as if hearing that question. For a heartbeat, the great cyclopean eye brightened, not with psychic fire, but with something gentler, like the last light of a candle. He could remember when his father's dream had seemed inevitable, when the Imperium was a lattice of stars and hope, not of war and edicts. He could remember when knowledge felt like ascent, not trespass. Yet the visions had come, dreams of a wolf in the dark, of a throne cracked by a sun's whisper, of feathers burning before they could take flight. He had tried to warn, to guide, to hold back the tide, but warnings themselves can be weapons, and guidance can be a chain. Outside, the wind carried flakes of glass from shattered domes, each one catching the red light of the twin suns as they flickered, dying. Statues of philosophers lay toppled across the plaza like fallen titans. The psychic wards etched into their bases hissed and bled warp light, unraveling in slow curls. Magnus felt it under his feet, the tremor of reality peeling, the warp seeping through the seams like ink through cloth. This was not only the death of a city, but of a certainty, that the Emperor would forgive, that the suns could remain whole. He closed his eye and reached inward. Once his mind had been a cathedral, filled with choral harmonies of his legion, every brother's thought a note in a great symphony. Now it was an empty hall, echoing with his own footfalls. They had believed him. They had followed him. And yet their faith was a knife turned inward. The Edict of Nicaea had cut them off from their greatest gift, and still he had hoped obedience might heal the breach. But hope had curdled into secrecy. Secrecy had ripened into sin. The galaxy beyond was not watching, it rarely does. Yet the warp did, and in its roiling depths, something vast stirred at the scent of a faltering soul. Magnus felt that gaze on him, not as a voice or a bargain, but as a reflection of his own ambition. He had wanted to preserve knowledge, to master fate, to outwit prophecy. But prophecy, like the warp, is not mastered, it is endured. He walked to a balcony overlooking the ruins. The towers below looked like organs in a dissected body, each spire a nerve, each bridge a vein. Once, thought had pulsed along them. Now ash drifted like snow, and silence pressed against his skin. He remembered his father's hands, calloused from labor, radiant with purpose, laying a crown of words on him. Magnus, my son, my seeker of truths. He remembered the pride that had swelled in his chest, the certainty that he would never betray that trust. He wondered if, in some far hall on Terra, the Emperor was remembering too, or only erasing. He did not know yet how close the wolves had come, or how soon the sky would burn, but he felt the hinge of destiny under his palm, the subtle tilt of all things toward an unseen precipice. He thought of Ahriman, his most gifted son, who even now was weaving calculations in secret chambers. He thought of the council, split between obedience and rebellion. He thought of the scarlet planet glimpsed in dreams, a place of exile where their power might persist, but their souls might not. Above him, a rift of warp light opened like an eyelid, then closed. The tremor passed. Magnus exhaled. He was still, for this moment, a man choosing, not yet a monster chosen. He pressed his hand to the stone rail, felt the chill, and whispered words meant for no one but himself. Father, forgive me. I tried. Far below, in the ruined courtyards, a few of his legion walked like ghosts between fallen columns, their armor dulled to brownish red by dust. They looked up at the balcony, but did not call out. They could feel their Primarch's conflict, even without words. They had sworn to him not only their swords, but their minds. Yet even minds can fray when held too long at the edge of the warp. Some were already fraying. Some were already gone. Magnus turned back into the library. He traced the sigils etched into the floor, the wards that had once glowed with serene blue power. Now they flickered, cracked, and bled light like wounds. Each symbol was a memory of a lesson taught, a promise made. He knelt, pressing his forehead to the stone, and for a moment the great Primarch looked like a penitent scholar at prayer. But his prayer was not for salvation. It was for understanding why knowledge, which had been given as a gift, had become a curse. Why loyalty, which had been nurtured as a bond, had become a chain. The narrator's voice softens, as if speaking directly into the listener's ear. This is how empires die. Not with a single battle, but with a question unanswered, a trust mislaid, a choice postponed until it can no longer be postponed. This is how heroes become warnings, and somewhere, even now, a part of Magnus still hopes that telling this story might change its ending. Outside, the ash thickens, the suns dim, the psychic hum grows fainter, like a choir receding down a long corridor. Soon the wolves will come. Soon the warning meant to save will be counted as treachery. Soon the scholar's hands will shape his own chains. But for this moment, in the last light of Prospero's burning world, he stands between what he was and what he will become, and the galaxy holds its breath. Prospero breathed as if it were alive. At dawn, its glass towers caught the first pale light, and turned it into 1,000 slow-moving beams that swam across streets paved with obsidian and inlaid runes. The air trembled with psychic wind, soft currents of thought weaving between spires like invisible birds. On balconies and in hidden atriums, acolytes in crimson and gold practiced their arts, levitating scrolls with a gesture, conjuring memories from dust, singing equations that glowed as auroras. To walk here was to walk through the mind of a world that believed knowledge could be shaped like clay and passed from one hand to another without ever breaking. At the highest terrace of the great pyramid of Tizca, Magnus stood watching the city awaken. His hair caught the morning light like a red banner in a slow breeze, his single golden eye reflecting the panorama below. Pride swelled in him, but with it came a fine crack of unease, like frost spreading over glass. These were his sons, his students, his mirror fragments. And yet, when he looked into the warp beyond the sky, he felt it whisper in a language older than stars. Even the psychic wind smelled faintly of metal and ozone now, a taste of storms forming far away. Around him, a circle of 1,000 suns knelt in meditation. Their armor glimmered with shifting sigils, blue one moment, copper the next, as if the warp's light were brushing against them. Ahriman was among them, hood lowered, eyes closed. Where the others radiated focus, Ahriman radiated tension, like a bowstring drawn too far. Magnus sensed it without looking, the way a father senses a child's secret before it is spoken. He had raised these warriors from boys of many worlds, had taught them to be scholars before killers. Yet here he stood, wondering if he had also taught them to question everything, including him. He descended a set of rune-lit steps into the Hall of Mirrors, a place where light refracted through crystalline panels etched with equations of soul and matter. Flames burned in silver bowls, casting reflections that multiplied endlessly across the walls. This hall had been built as a metaphor, every truth seen from 1,000 angles, every flame doubled until its origin could not be known. Magnus paused before a panel showing his own reflection, split into countless red figures, each with a different expression: pride, anger, sorrow, resolve. He wondered which of them was truly him. Ahriman followed silently, his boots clicking on the inlaid floor. "You called for me," he said at last, voice low. Even his words seemed to echo more than once, bouncing from mirror to mirror. Magnus did not turn. "I wanted you to see this place again, to remember what it was meant to teach. I remember." Ahriman's gaze slid across the panels, catching glimpses of himself in 6 poses, each one a little older, a little darker. That knowledge is infinite and dangerous. That truth changes shape, depending on the angle from which it is seen. That power requires discipline. Magnus's tone sharpened like a blade, but softened immediately. Discipline is not chains. It is the form that keeps the clay from collapsing before it hardens. Ahriman hesitated, then stepped closer. "And yet clay still cracks, Father." He used the title not as the legionaries did, but as a son would. "You have seen it. In the warp." In us, Magnus finally turned, and for a moment the great Primarch looked like a weary teacher. "I have seen possibilities, shadows of choices, nothing inevitable." "But the great rift grows louder," Ahriman said. "Even our dreams taste of iron and ash. The edict forbids us to strengthen our defenses. You tell us to obey, but you also tell us to seek. How can we do both?" Flame and mirror played across their faces. Magnus's a single molten eye, Ahriman's twin orbs like deep wells. They stood as 2 versions of the same hunger, one ancient, one still forming. Magnus reached out, palm brushing the mirrored wall. In its surface he saw not Ahriman, but the Emperor's face, distant and austere. "Because obedience preserves trust," he said quietly. "And without trust, no empire stands." Ahriman's jaw tightened, and without knowledge, Magnus let his hand fall. "Then no soul survives." They walked further into the hall, passing students practicing delicate manipulations of warp energy. A girl levitated a sphere of water and slowly braided strands of light through it, shaping a memory of her homeworld into a shimmering globe. Another whispered to a stone until it unfolded like paper, revealing layers of fossilized thought. They glanced up at their primarch and the chief librarian, eyes shining with reverence, but also with unspoken questions. Even in this place of learning, rumors coiled like smoke. The council divided, the wolves stirring, their father on terror turning away. Magnus stopped at a balcony where the hall opened onto the city. Below them, Tizca's canals shimmered with liquid crystal. Psychic wind brushed their robes, carrying scents of ink, copper, and a faint acrid tang of ozone. He spoke softly, almost to himself. They are beautiful, aren't they? All of them, not just soldiers, but seekers. They look to you for certainty, Ahriman said, but your eyes are elsewhere. I see storms on the horizon. Then tell them, Ahriman urged. Tell me. Magnus closed his eye and drew a slow breath. If I tell them, they will act. If they act, the future will change. And if it changes, what I have seen may become what I fear most. That is not an answer. No. Magnus opened his eye again. It is the only truth I have. Silence stretched between them. In the mirrored wall behind, their reflections bent and multiplied. A dozen pairs of figures facing each other like chess pieces. The flames hissed. Somewhere a bell tolled 3 times, a signal for another convocation. Outside, the light shifted as if a shadow had passed over the twin suns. For an instant, the city's color dulled like paint washed by grey water. Ahriman stepped back, clasping his hands behind his back. I will keep studying, he said at last, but I will also prepare. Because if storms are coming, knowledge alone will not shield us. Magnus's gaze softened, and something like pride flickered across his face before vanishing. You are my finest student, he murmured, and perhaps my sternest conscience. Ahriman bowed his head, but did not smile. Then may conscience serve you as well as knowledge has. He left the hall, robes whispering against the floor. Magnus remained, staring at his fractured reflections. Each flame in the silver bowls wavered as if blown by an unseen breath. He thought of the warp, of its endless mirror labyrinth, and wondered whether Prospero had become another reflection in that maze, already lost. The narrator's voice draws nearer again, warm but low, as if speaking to someone drowsing beside a fire. The city seems to slow, its psychic winds like a lullaby. This is the 1,000 suns at their height, beautiful, brilliant, doomed, though they do not yet know it. This is Magnus the Red, torn between the pride of a father and the dread of a prophet. This is Ahriman, still a confidant, not yet an exile. And in the hall of flames and mirrors, 2 ambitions glimmer like twin stars. One burning steady, one flickering, both casting shadows. Outside, the sunlit towers sway in heat shimmer. The warp hum curls beneath the city like a hidden river. Somewhere far away, on a world of gold and marble, an emperor broods, and a wolf sharpens its fangs. But here, on Prospero, the scholar's burden is still a choice, not a verdict. And for a moment, in the breath between knowing and doing, the city shines as it always dreamed it would. The message arrived not as parchment or vox, but as a psychic echo that rippled through every library and tower of Prospero. It was the edict of Nicaea, the emperor's will made into words sharp enough to cut through the warp itself. To the citizens, it came as a tremor in the sky, a brief dimming of the twin suns. To the 1,000 suns, it came like a cold hand closing on the heart. No more sorcery, no more hidden arts, no more the craft that defined them. Magnus read it alone in his private sanctum, a chamber built of dark glass, shot through with golden veins, where the warp's currents were muted to a low murmur. He stood before the projection of the decree, its runes blazing with the Emperor's seal, and felt the foundation of his world shift. The words were both command and wound. He had expected censure, perhaps a curtailing of their practices, but this was annihilation disguised as law. His father's voice, once a beacon in his mind, was absent now, replaced by the silence of a door closed. He touched the shimmering script and felt it burn his palm. Not pain, but a memory. Of Terra's vaults where he had first walked beside the Emperor, of promises made under banners of gold, of a vision of an imperium united by knowledge, not fear. The edict dissolved those memories into ash. He tried to swallow the bitterness, to frame it as necessary discipline, but the taste clung like iron. Outside, the city still moved, as if nothing had happened. Students floated scrolls between balconies, murmuring mantras. Children played games of thought and light. But under it all was a new current, uncertainty. The edict had reached every mind. Its silence hummed like a second heartbeat beneath the psychic wind. Magnus summoned his captains. They gathered in a circular chamber, lined with obsidian pillars, etched with glyphs of concealment. Flames burned low in copper bowls, throwing long shadows across their crimson armor. Ahriman stood slightly apart, hood raised, eyes glittering. Around the circle were men whose names had become parables. Phosis Takar with his lion's bearing, Hathor Mat, whose words were careful as surgical cuts, and others who had shaped the legion's soul as much as its warcraft. Magnus entered without ceremony, the edict still flickering above his palm. "You have all read it," he said. His voice was steady but quiet, like a tide pulling back before a storm. "You know what it demands." Phosis's gauntlets clenched. "It demands that we cease to be ourselves." "It demands obedience," said Hathor Mart, voice soft but firm, "and obedience preserves unity." "We swore to uphold the Imperium." Ahriman tilted his head. "We swore to uphold truth. If the Imperium now fears truth, what then?" The chamber darkened, as if the flames themselves had leaned inward to listen. Magnus looked from one face to another, reading not only expressions but thought currents. Doubt curled around pride. Anger sparked against loyalty. They were mirrors of his own turmoil. "The Emperor believes," Magnus began slowly, "that the warp is a flame that will consume us. He forbids us to touch it, lest it spread." Phosis's voice was rough. "We have mastered it. It is not the warp that threatens us, but ignorance." Hathor Mart's gaze flickered to the Primarch. "Mastery is an illusion, my lord. You have told us that yourself." Magnus's eye burned. "I have told you that mastery requires vigilance, not abandonment. To abandon our gift is to cripple ourselves. Yet," he broke off, the word hanging like smoke. "Yet you would obey," Ahriman said quietly. Magnus's jaw tightened. He wanted to rebuke, to remind them who he was, but the truth lay too close to the surface. He still clung to his father's vision. He still loved the Emperor, and in that love was the wound. He dismissed the projection. The runes winked out, leaving only the flames. "I have always taught you that knowledge without discipline is ruin, but discipline without knowledge is blindness. We must find a path between." Phosis stepped forward, fists at his sides. "And if there is no path, then we will make one," Magnus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Silence pressed in. The captains shifted, their psychic auras dimming and flaring like storm clouds. Ahriman's eyes met Magnus's, a silent plea and a challenge entwined. "Tell us what you will do. Tell us who we must be." But Magnus could not. He felt the warp at the edges of the chamber, murmuring possibilities. In one, he defied the edict and was cast out. In another, he obeyed and watched his sons wither. Both were ruin. After a long moment, he said only, "For now we obey. We will lay aside the practices named forbidden. We will study in secret if we must, but we will show loyalty." Phocis exhaled like a hiss of steam. Loyalty to what? To the Imperium, Hathor Mart answered, before Magnus could speak. To our father. Ahriman's hood shadowed his face. Loyalty bought with silence may cost more than defiance. Magnus lifted his head. Enough. You will not speak of defiance again. Not here. Not yet. The flames guttered, then steadied. The captains bowed, some stiffly, and filed out one by one. Only Ahriman lingered. You do not believe your own words, he said when they were alone. Magnus turned away, staring at the obsidian pillars. Belief is a luxury. Duty is a chain. You taught me chains can be broken. Magnus almost smiled, but the expression died. Go, Ahriman. Continue your studies, but be careful. The warp listens more closely now. Ahriman's voice softened. So does the Imperium. He left, his footfalls echoing like fading heartbeats. Magnus remained, alone in the chamber, surrounded by pillars carved with sigils of concealment that now felt like bars. The psychic wind outside rose, carrying faint cries, not of fear, but of longing, like a people reaching for a book just out of grasp. He pressed his palm to the floor, feeling the hum of the planet beneath. Prospero had always been a beacon of the mind, a library in orbit around a dream. Now it was a monastery under siege, though no blade had yet been drawn. He closed his eye and let images rise, his father's face distant as a star, the edict like a wall between them, the great rift whispering just beyond. He thought of flames and mirrors, of his sons as reflections. How long before those reflections cracked? The narrator's voice folds closer, like a shadowed hand over a candle. This is the moment when silence becomes heavier than sound. This is Magnus the Red, still clinging to faith, still hoping obedience will heal, yet feeling hunger coil beneath. This is the Legion beginning to fracture, the first fault lines hidden under polished marble. Outside, the twin suns dipped, casting Prospero in copper twilight. The towers gleamed like spears of frozen fire. In hidden chambers, captains whispered, some to obey, some to prepare, some to plan. Above them all, Magnus stood at the window of his sanctum, a solitary figure in red, torn between love and knowledge, duty and truth. The edict had been spoken. The silence had begun. Night fell over Prospero like a veil of black glass. And the psychic winds that had once carried soft murmurs now roared in Magnus's mind. In his private sanctum, the candles had long since guttered, leaving only the glow of warp runes that pulsed like heartbeats underwater. He had read the edict. He had watched his sons wrestle with obedience and defiance, and now he felt the tide turning. Horus, beloved brother, falling into darkness, the Emperor blind to the wound, the Imperium sliding towards civil war, like a ship toward a reef. If silence was loyalty, then loyalty was death. He could not remain silent. He stood barefoot on the circle of ward lines he had etched himself, a geometry older than Prospero, older than any empire. Around him, the air shimmered with motes of gold and flecks of blood-red light, as though the chamber itself had been submerged. He breathed slowly, as a swimmer does before plunging, and began the incantation. Not words, but thoughts shaped into chords. They rolled through the sanctum like waves, rising higher until even the walls trembled. To pierce the veil of terror was to drown in the warp. He knew this. The Emperor had built wards upon wards, a labyrinth of psychic locks. Magnus reached for them anyway, his mind stretching like a bridge across a chasm. He felt the first barrier break, a shimmer of cold water over his skin. Then another, thicker, tasting of iron and incense. He went deeper, and the warp rose around him, not as fire, but as an ocean without surface or floor, luminous with drifting memories. He sank. His crimson skin darkened to shadow. His hair floated like weeds. His single eye opened wider than flesh should allow. Shapes swam past him, golden eagles, burning feathers, faces of brothers lost. The water was warm with blood and bright with stars, a paradox of comfort and terror. Somewhere far above, Prospero receded until it was only a fleck of light. Somewhere far below, terror glimmered like a sunken city. He whispered a name, Father, and the ocean quivered. The current changed. A vast presence moved through the deep, neither hostile nor welcoming. The Emperor's wards loomed ahead, like titanic gates of bone and light. They pulsed with runes older than speech, each one a warning, each one a scar. Magnus reached out with his mind and felt them resist, but he pressed on. Threads of gold coiled around his wrists like chains. Blood-red streams seeped from the cracks, stinging his skin. He thought of his brothers, of Horus crowned in treachery, of the Imperium poised to devour itself. He thought of silence as complicity. He gathered his will into a single spear of thought and thrust it forward. The gates shuddered. Warp water poured through fissures. He felt the Emperor's presence flare, bright as a star at noon, and for a heartbeat he saw his father not as a distant ruler, but as a figure bent over a vast design, unaware of the shadow at its edge. "Forgive me," Magnus whispered, though his voice in the warp was a tide roaring over reefs. "I tried." Images flooded him. Horus on a black field, space wolves sharpening blades, a crimson planet burning. He tried to shape them into a warning, but the ocean distorted everything, turning his plea into thunder, his words into storms. The Emperor turned, and where Magnus had hoped for recognition, he felt only shock, then anger, then the closing of a door. The warp convulsed. Gates cracked like ice. A tremor shot through Terra's wards, through the golden throne itself. Magnus felt it, a fracture echoing across reality. His spear of thought had pierced more than secrecy. It had torn a path. Through that path, other things stirred, shadows with eyes like coals, hands like smoke. They reached toward the light of terror, curious, hungry. He tried to withdraw, but the current seized him, dragging him downward past memories and prophecies. He saw his sons turning to dust, their armor hollow. He saw himself towering over a crimson wasteland, wings of fire sprouting from his back. He saw the Emperor's gaze fixed not on him, but through him, at something only he could see. "Forgive me," he whispered again, softer now, a child's voice in a flood. "I wanted to save you." The ocean rose in answer, a hiss of surf on sand. Then, with a wrench like tearing cloth, Magnus was hurled back into his sanctum. He fell to his knees, hands braced on the ward lines. They were smoking, cracks running through them like dry riverbeds. The runes bled light. Ash drifted from the ceiling. His chest heaved, his eye burned. The warp's taste lingered on his tongue, salt and iron. He staggered to his feet. Outside the window, the twin suns flickered, momentarily dimmed. Across the city, subtle tremors shook the glass towers. Psychers gasped mid-mantra. Children dropped their crystal toys. Birds of thought vanished like smoke. None of them yet knew why, but they had felt it. Something had been broken far away, and its echo was reaching them. Magnus pressed a hand to the glass. For an instant he thought he could see terror across the void, its marble spires, its labyrinth of wards cracking like eggshells. He thought he could hear his father's voice, not as words, but as a silence sharper than sound. And behind that silence, a hiss, a chuckle, a promise. He closed his eye. His body trembled as though still submerged. He had done what he swore not to do. He had pierced the veil. He had tried to warn and instead had wounded. The act meant to save had sown seeds of doom. In the corridors below, his sons whispered, feeling the change in the air. Some would call it a victory of courage. Others would name it the first step toward exile. Magnus said nothing. He stood in the dim sanctum, water dripping from an invisible sea, and whispered once more to a father who might never forgive him. "Forgive me." The wards of terror shivered again, faint cracks glowing like veins of fire. The warp smelled of salt and ash, and somewhere far off, a wolf raised its head and began to howl. Prospero still shone, but now its brilliance felt staged, like a theatre set lit too brightly to hide the cracks in the floorboards. At dusk, the glass towers glimmered with thousands of sigils, each one a veil rather than a beacon. The psychic wind no longer sang openly through the streets. It coiled into hidden alleys, curling like smoke from a shuttered hearth. From a distance, Tisca appeared unchanged. Canals gleaming, terraces alive with scholars, plazas busy with debates, yet behind every mirrored window, cabals whispered and drew new lines of loyalty. Magnus walked the upper promenades at twilight, robe drawn tight against a wind that was colder than it should be. Below, he could feel the hum of secret rituals echoing beneath the stone. Circles traced at midnight, pacts spoken in silence. His sons were obeying the edict in public and defying it in private. Even those who believed in restraint were building new paths through old mazes. He had hoped obedience would heal the rift with terror. Instead, it had only driven his legion inward, like a wound closing over poison. In his dreams, feathers burned. Red light bled into a dark ocean. Sometimes he glimpsed the crimson planet again, its surface cracked like pottery, warp mist rising from fissures. Sometimes he heard Ahriman's voice calling from across a chasm, asking questions Magnus could not answer. He would wake before dawn, with ash on his tongue, the sound of distant wings fading from his ear. Ahriman, meanwhile, had begun to keep his own counsel. Once he had come readily at Magnus's summons. Now he arrived late, or sent word through intermediaries. In the Hall of Mirrors, where they had once debated openly, he now spoke in measured phrases, as if each word were a card played face down. Magnus saw the change, but did not confront it. Perhaps he feared what the answer might be. One evening, he found Ahriman standing on a balcony overlooking the lower city, watching acolytes cross a bridge of light from one tower to another. Their robes billowed in the psychic wind like banners of war disguised as ceremony. "They hide their work now," Ahriman said without preamble, "even from each other." Magnus joined him, leaning on the rail. "They are frightened. Frightened minds seek control or power," Ahriman said. Magnus studied his son's profile. "Which are you seeking?" Ahriman's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "Understanding. Always understanding. But when understanding is forbidden, power is the only language left." Magnus felt the words land like stones in water. He had taught Ahriman to see hidden currents. Now he was watching him follow them. "The edict binds us," he said softly, "but it does not have to define us." "Does it not?" Ahriman turned, his eyes bright in the dim light. "You still believe Father's vision is intact?" Yet every night you wake from dreams of burning feathers. You have seen what is coming. You know the wolves have already been unleashed. Magnus stiffened, but did not answer. He could not admit how much he had seen, how deep into the warp he had reached. His warning to terror had cracked more than wards. It had cracked his certainty. Ahriman's gaze sharpened. You tell us half-truths. You ask for patience while the future burns. How long before patience becomes complicity? Magnus turned away, watching the city instead. Students crossed the bridge, heads bowed. Below them the canals glimmered with shifting colours, warp light bleeding through like oil through cloth. We will endure, he said finally. We will find a way to endure. Ahriman's voice dropped. Endure, yes. But at what cost? He left before Magnus could reply, robes whispering like paper across stone. The cabals grew bolder. In subterranean vaults beneath the Great Pyramid, groups of sorcerers convened under false names, building secret lexicons of spells masked as meditations. Some sought only to protect their minds from the wolves they felt approaching. Others dreamed of striking first, of reshaping the Imperium before it could crush them. Symbols of flame and mirrors reappeared on hidden walls. Flame for transformation, mirror for duplicity. Magnus moved among them like a shadow, aware but not intervening. He could not forbid what he had once inspired. Instead, he tried to steer quietly. A word here, a glance there. But he felt influence slipping from his grasp like sand through fingers. He had wanted to build a legion of seekers. He was getting a parliament of conspirators. At night, his dreams deepened. The red planet bled more fiercely now, its rivers bright as molten copper. Feathers burned to ash before they could lift. He heard his father's voice, distant as thunder beyond mountains, calling his name with neither warmth nor wrath, only inevitability. He woke with his eye watering from unseen smoke. One night, he dreamt of a hall lined with statues of his sons, each hollow, each armor filled with dust. He walked among them until he came to Ahriman's statue, still intact but cracking down the center. When he reached out to touch it, it split open and a mirror fell from within, reflecting not Ahriman but himself. Older, winged, his face a mask of regret. He woke before dawn, hand pressed to his chest as if holding something in. Outside, Prospero was silent, the psychic wind gone still. In the days that followed, whispers reached him of a new cabal forming, one that sought to act where he would not. He called his captains together, but found their seats empty, excuses offered. Even Phocis, once his loudest advocate, had begun to hold private meetings. Magnus felt the distance growing like a physical space between them, a corridor lined with doors all closed. He retreated to his sanctum, hoping for clarity, but his thoughts only spiraled. He stood before a mirror etched with ward lines, flames flickering on either side. His reflection looked back at him, not as a single image, but as layers. Teacher, father, sorcerer, traitor. He pressed his palm to the glass and felt it cold. I am still with you, he whispered, though he did not know to whom he spoke. Behind him, the door opened softly. Ahriman stepped in, hood lowered. We are preparing, he said without greeting. Magnus did not turn. For what? For what you will not name, Ahriman replied. You think secrecy protects us. It only breeds shadows. Magnus closed his eye. There are truths that wound more than they heal. And there are wounds that become truths, Ahriman said. Silence stretched. Magnus finally turned, but Ahriman had already left, the door swinging shut. He stood alone in the sanctum, flames guttering low. Outside, the twin suns dipped toward the horizon. casting the city in crimson and gold. From a distance, Prospero still looked like a jewel of learning. Up close, it was a hall of masks, each face hiding a question, each question hiding a blade. Magnus pressed his fingers to the mirror again. The glass rippled once, as if something on the other side had touched back. He thought of the red planet bleeding into the warp, of feathers burning before flight, of suns preparing in secret. He thought of a father far away, a wolf drawing near, and the thin line between patience and betrayal. The narrator's voice slows, gentle but heavy, like a hand lowering a curtain. This is Prospero, no longer innocent but masked. This is Magnus, caught between silence and confession, his dreams turning from warnings into prophecies. This is Ahriman, shifting from confidant to questioner, a shadow at the edge of loyalty. Outside, night gathered. The canals reflected blood-colored stars. Somewhere deep below, a cabal drew a circle on the floor and whispered names they should not know. And high above, Magnus stood at the window, a single figure in red, watching his city become a maze of secrets. Above Prospero, the stars changed. Patterns that had been fixed for centuries shifted subtly, like hunters moving through undergrowth. First came reports from distant astropaths, flickers in the warp, signals gone dead, a sense of being watched. Then came the shadows of hulls sliding through translation, thousands of kilometers long, their prows shaped like wolves' heads. The space wolves and the sisters of silence had been dispatched. Though on Prospero, no one yet dared say the words aloud. In Tisca, the twin suns rose as usual, casting gold across glass towers. But the psychic wind tasted of iron. Children practiced telepathy in the courtyard gardens. Small hands clasped around crystal orbs as they tried to lift them with thought. Some orbs quivered, some rose, some fell. Their laughter was soft but strained, like a song sung under one's breath. Their tutors watched with smiles too tight, each smile a mask of reassurance for eyes that had already glimpsed the truth. In the great library, senior librarians moved through aisles of runic shelves, closing volumes as though closing windows before a storm. They whispered preservation mantras over each tome, sealing knowledge in memory stones, or casting it into the immaterium's hidden vaults. Scrolls glowed briefly and winked out. Thought stones dissolved into sparks. One by one, the lights dimmed. When apprentices asked why, the answers were gentle lies, an inventory, a precaution, a ritual. But the older ones knew. Their voices broke when they said the words. On the upper terraces, Magnus walked alone, robe trailing ash across marble. From here he could see the horizon darken, as if dusk were gathering at noon. Fleets he could not yet see had already cast their shadows across the warp. The Emperor's censure had become a blade. His brothers had become executioners. He still loved them, but love was no armor. He paused beside a balcony where two young scholars practiced focus exercises, their eyes closed, foreheads almost touching. They opened them when they sensed him, awe flickering across their faces. "My lord," one began, but Magnus raised a hand for silence. He felt the weight of their thoughts, questions, hopes, fear, like birds fluttering inside a cage. He wanted to tell them to run, but there was nowhere to run. He wanted to tell them to be brave, but bravery was already written in their blood. Instead, he simply said, "Remember what you learn." Knowledge outlives walls. They bowed, and he left them, his steps echoing down the hall like a heartbeat growing fainter. In the Hall of Mirrors, his captains gathered again, though now they stood farther apart. The air was brittle with tension, reflections multiplying their unease. Ahriman stood near a silver bowl whose flame burned low and blue, the color of a fading pulse. "They are coming," Phocis Takar said bluntly. "Our seers confirm it, wolves and silent ones both. Their orders are clear." "We do not yet know their orders," Hathor Mart countered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps they come to escort, to censure. They come to kill," Ahriman said, cutting him off. His hood was lowered, his eyes sharp. "We feel it. Even the children feel it. Only you refuse to speak it aloud." Magnus stood at the center, head bowed. "If they come to kill, then war is inevitable." Phocis slammed a gauntlet into his palm. "Then we fight. We are not helpless scribes. We are warriors, sons of the Red Cyclops. We will show them the price of their treachery." Ahriman's gaze flicked to Magnus. "Or we could leave. We have ships. We have warning. We can take the Legion into the warp before they strike. We can survive Silence Fell." All eyes turned to their Primarch. Magnus raised his head, and for a moment they saw not a god, but a man weighted with impossible choice. His golden eye glimmered like an ember under ash. "I taught you," he said quietly, "that knowledge without discipline is ruin. But discipline without knowledge is blindness. We are standing at that edge now. If we fight, we become the traitors they already name us. If we flee, we prove their fear. If we submit, we trust a mercy that may not exist." Phocis's fists tightened. "So what then?" Magnus closed his eye, inhaling the scent of the dying flame. In the warp, he could already feel Russ's fury approaching, the sisters' silence like a blade drawn across thought. He saw possible futures branching like roots into darkness. In everyone, Prospero burned. "I will speak with my father," he said at last. "I will surrender this world if surrender spares it." Ahriman's jaw clenched. "And if it does not, then at least we will not be the ones to light the pyre," Magnus murmured. Phocis swore under his breath. Hathor Mart stared at the floor. The flame in the silver bowl flickered and went out. That night, Magnus dreamt of the red planet again, but now it bled openly into the warp, its rivers flowing upward into a sky of gold that cracked like glass. Feathers fell around him, burning before they could touch the ground. A figure stood at the horizon, a man-shaped silhouette, with wings of shadow and eyes of light. It raised a hand, not in blessing, but in judgment. Magnus tried to speak, but water filled his mouth. He woke gasping, the taste of salt and ash on his tongue. He rose and went to the window. The twin suns were eclipsed by a veil of warp light, colors shifting in sickly hues. The psychic wind was silent, as if the planet itself were holding its breath. He pressed his hand to the glass. "Father," he whispered, "tell me there is still a path." No answer came, only a faint, distant howl carried on the edge of thought. Across Tizca, the scholars continued their routines, but each gesture had become a farewell. Librarians sealed the last of the memory stones and stacked them like tomb markers. Students recited formulas as if committing them to eternity. Children played telepathy games, but their laughter was thin. The canals reflected not only the twin suns, but a darker shape moving among them, like a predator circling beneath clear water. In hidden vaults, cabals prepared spells of defense even as they denied doing so. Armor was polished under lamplight. Blades once ceremonial were sharpened. Banners were rolled and hidden. And yet in the plazas, incense still burned. Bells still chimed. Debates still echoed. As if sheer will could keep the city alive a little longer. Prospero had become a shrine to denial. Magnus walked among his people without heraldry. a tall figure in crimson robes blending with the crowd. Some recognized him and bowed. Others only felt a shiver of awe. He saw mothers teaching children meditation to calm nightmares. He saw old men etching runes of protection into doorframes, though they no longer believed in them. He saw his sons watching the skies, eyes narrowed, waiting for shapes to emerge. He returned to his sanctum before dawn. Ahriman waited there, hood lowered, hands clasped. "You will not flee," he said flatly. "No," Magnus replied. "You believe surrender will save them. I believe destiny may already be written, but I can still choose how we meet it." Ahriman's expression was unreadable. "Then may destiny be kinder than prophecy." He left without another word. Magnus stood alone as the first light touched the towers. Somewhere beyond the veil, the fleets drew nearer, their wolf prows glinting. Somewhere on Terra, a father turned away from a son. Prospero's scholars clung to their rituals, their denials, their hopes, but the air itself trembled with the approach of thunder. The narrator's voice softens, almost a whisper. "This is the stillness before slaughter, the breath before the blade. This is Magnus the Red, choosing not flight nor defiance, but surrender, or destiny." And as the twin suns rise over the city of glass, shadows lengthen like bars across its streets, and the first echoes of war begin to fall like distant rain. At dawn, Prospero's twin suns rose redder than blood, their light striking the glass towers so they flashed like blades. A low tremor rolled through the streets, at first like distant thunder, then like the groan of something ancient tearing. People looked up from their morning rituals and froze. In the warp, the psychic wind shrieked. Ships had arrived. The wolves had come. From the upper balconies, Magnus felt them before he saw them. A tide of grey-armoured warriors descending from orbit, their landing craft tearing contrails through the sky. The Sisters of Silence followed, dark wedges of nothingness sliding down into the atmosphere, their presence like a hole punched in thought. The city's psychic currents, once a flowing river, became a shattered mirror of eddies and voids. Every telepath in Titska tasted iron on their tongues. On the plaza below, scholars dropped scrolls. Children clasped their heads as sudden silence crushed their minds. Birds of thought dissolved like mist. The sky roared. Drop pods punched into marble avenues, smashing mosaics that had taken decades to lay. Out spilled the space wolves, frost-fanged and roaring, bolters flashing in the dim morning. Against the city's polished glass, they were storm and stone, crude but unstoppable. Their howls rose like winter breaking, echoing through the canals. Magnus stood motionless for a moment, his crimson robes snapping in the rising wind. He had believed, hoped, that surrender might spare them. Yet the first bolts were already fired. His eye burned, not with warp light, but with grief. Through the warp, he felt the Emperor's absence like an empty throne, and beneath that, the snarl of Russ, brother once loved, now executioner. In the great library's courtyards, librarians tried to form defensive wards, even as they herded apprentices toward the inner sanctums. The air reeked of ozone and burning parchment. Psychic screams reverberated through the marble halls, not only from the wounded, but from thought itself breaking under the sisters' null fields. Runes etched into floors flickered and went dark. Crystal globes burst like eggs. On the western terraces, Phosis Takar led a phalanx of scarlet-armoured warriors down marble stairs, banners snapping. Their helms glowed with restrained power, hands clenched on force axes. "Hold your ground," he barked, but his voice cracked. Above them, Grey-armored shapes leapt from a drop pod, landing like meteors. Bolt of fire tore into the front rank. Psychic wards flared and failed. Men screamed as their gifts were smothered mid-incantation, their minds torn open by silence. Ahriman fought in the shadows of a collapsed colonnade, hurling bolts of warp light only to see them gutter as sisters approached. His incantations frayed on his lips. Around him his brothers faltered, some reaching for blades, some for books, not knowing which would save them. He glimpsed Magnus far above, a crimson figure on a balcony, and felt a surge of fury and despair. He should have fled. He should have prepared. He should be here. Magnus at last descended from the balcony. He walked through corridors filled with fleeing scholars, his presence parting them like water. In his mind, he still whispered to his father, begging for a reprieve that did not come. Every step echoed with memories of debates held in these halls, lessons given, promises made. Now those echoes were overlaid with the sound of bolters and the crash of breaking glass. He entered the Hall of Mirrors. Shards from shattered panels littered the floor, reflecting flame and smoke in 1,000 tiny fragments. Flames burned blue and green as psychic residue ignited. In the center of the hall, a group of his captains gathered, faces pale under helm rims. "My lord," Hathor Mart began, "they are slaughtering us." Magnus raised a hand. "I know." Phocis staggered in, armor scored by claws. "We can still push them back to the landing zone. Give the word." Ahriman's eyes blazed. "Or open the hidden vaults. Release what we have bound. You forbade it, but without it, we are nothing but dust." Magnus looked from one to another. His eyes saw more than faces. He saw loyalty fraying, love turning to accusation, the bonds between brothers unspooling like torn thread. He had wanted to be their father, their guide. Now he was their ruin. Above the city, the sky cracked with thunder. A massive figure descended through the smoke, wrapped in pelts and runes of ice, his blade a crescent of frostfire. Russ had come at last. The warp around him churned with his fury, but at its core was something colder, duty executed without pause. Magnus felt it pierce him more sharply than any weapon. He remembered laughter with this brother, remembered sparring, remembered trust. All gone now, burned away by orders and prophecy. Outside the hall, a detonation shook the floor. Dust fell from the ceiling, coating the mirrored shards. Phocis lifted his axe. "My lord." "No." Magnus's voice carried like a bell through smoke. "No more slaughter. Not if I can stop it." He strode past them into the open air. The terraces below were chaos. Space wolves charging, thousand suns breaking, sisters moving like shadows of nullity. The canals boiled where psychic fire met water. Statues toppled. Children screamed as psychic echoes overwhelmed them. The city of glass had become a crucible of blood. Magnus stepped onto the balcony's edge. Power gathered around him, swirling crimson and gold, his robes snapping in a wind that was no longer natural. He raised his arms, not to strike, but to shield. A dome of warp light blossomed outward, halting bolter rounds mid-flight, shoving warriors apart like toys. For a moment, silence fell. Even the sisters paused at the edge of his power. Across the battlefield, Russ looked up, eyes narrowing. He raised his frostblade and pointed it at Magnus. "Brother," Magnus whispered, voice carrying through the warp as clearly as speech. "Stop this." Russ's reply was a snarl and a charge. Magnus descended from the balcony in a single stride, the warp bearing him like a tide. He landed on the plaza, the ground cracking under his weight. Around them, soldiers stumbled back, giving space to titans. Russ swung his blade. Magnus caught it with his palm. Warp light, flaring, frost biting into his flesh. For a heartbeat their eyes met, wolf and scholar, executioner and condemned. Memory flickered between them. A shared campaign, a shared joke, a shared oath. Then the moment broke. Russ tore his blade free and struck again. Magnus parried, each blow sending ripples through the plaza. Glass towers shuddered. Flames bent sideways. Psychic screams rose as bonds between brothers collapsed. In the warp, Magnus felt his restraint crumbling, his last hopes burning. He had wanted to shield his sons. Now he could only witness their undoing. Ahriman watched from a shattered archway. Horror etched into his face. He felt the warp convulse around his Primarch. Saw wings of fire flicker behind him like phantoms. Saw a destiny forming that Magnus had tried to refuse. "Father," he whispered, but no one heard. Russ pressed the attack, frostblade flashing. Magnus staggered, bleeding golden ichor. Around them the battle raged, space wolves and thousand suns locked in combat, glass towers falling like trees. Sisters moved through the melee, their silence devouring spells mid-chant. The air rang with bolter fire and the brittle chime of breaking crystal. Magnus caught Russ's blade a final time, holding it inches from his throat. "Brother," he said again, voice breaking. "You don't have to." Russ snarled, muscles straining. "I do." Something inside Magnus gave way. Not his body, not his power, but his restraint. Warp light exploded from him in a wave, crimson and gold, shattering windows for miles. The psychic dome inverted, becoming a storm. Space wolves were hurled back. Sisters clutched at their heads. The plaza cracked open, canals boiling. For an instant, Magnus stood taller, wings of fire unfurling behind him, eye blazing like a sun. He was no longer the scholar trying to obey. He was the Primarch betrayed. He released the blade and stepped back, breathing hard. Russ stumbled, frost dripping from his weapon. Around them silence fell again, but it was the silence of a void after an explosion, a vacuum pulling everything inward. Magnus looked at his brother, at his sons, at the burning city, and felt the bonds between them break like threads of glass. He turned away, tears of molten gold streaking his face. "Father," he whispered into the warp, though he knew no answer would come. "Forgive us all." Above, Prospero burned. Glass towers fell, shattering into fragments that caught the light of twin suns gone dark. Psychic screams echoed across the planet, a symphony of breaking crystal. And somewhere beyond, in the eye of terror's distant future, a red planet waited. Smoke curled over Prospero like a black tide as the two giants closed on each other. The plaza that had once been a meeting place for scholars and acolytes now lay cracked and burning, glass mosaics shattered into glittering sand. Space wolves and thousand suns fought in the periphery, their clashes muffled by the psychic. Storm hanging over the city, but in the center, everything narrowed to a single point. Magnus and Russ. Brother against brother. Destiny against choice. They circled one another as if drawn by opposing orbits. Russ's frostblade hissed with runes of ice, steam rising where it touched the scorched stones. Magnus's hands glowed with restrained power, crimson light coiling up his arms like serpents. For a heartbeat they did not move. Their eyes locked and memory flooded between them. Campaigns fought side by side, laughter on distant worlds, the oath they had sworn to the Emperor and to each other. That memory flickered like sunlight behind an eclipse. There, then gone. Russ moved first, a blur of pelts and muscle, his blade arcing like a cold crescent moon. Magnus slipped aside, warp light bursting under his feet, but did not strike back. He raised a hand, palm open. "Brother," he called, voice carrying over the din. "Listen to me. This is wrong." Russ's answer was the blade swinging again, heavier, faster. "Orders are orders," he growled. "You broke the oath. You brought this on yourself." Magnus caught the blade with both hands, power flaring. Frost bit into his palms, but he held it. "I warned father of Horus's treachery. I tried to save him." Russ's eyes were glacial. "And in trying, you tore open his wards. You've doomed us all." The frost blade shuddered between them. For an instant, they were locked like wrestlers, their faces inches apart. Half light, half shadow, their old affection warped by duty. Around them the psychic storm churned, casting alternating bands of gold and black across their armor, so they seemed to flicker between past and present selves. Magnus released the blade and leapt back, landing amid shards of broken glass. His robes were scorched, his eye blazing. "You think this is justice? It's butchery. You think Father's will is pure? He sends you to kill what he cannot face." Russ advanced, boots cracking the tiles. Better a butcher than a traitor. That word struck deeper than any blade. Magnus felt it lodge under his ribs, a splinter of ice. He remembered kneeling before the Emperor, hearing his father's voice say, "My seeker of truths." Now that voice was absent. In the warp, he could feel the Emperor's gaze turning away, not in wrath, but in disappointment. The light that had always been there was dimming. He parried another blow. Frost burst against warp fire, steam billowing like clouds. The plaza became an eclipse of elements, ice and flame, silence and screams. Each strike Russ delivered cracked another layer of Magnus's restraint. Each parry Magnus made sent ripples through the warp, rattling the city's remaining wards. Somewhere high above, towers toppled. Somewhere deep below, seals etched into Prospero's foundation split with faint blue light. Ahriman watched from a fallen archway, his face pale. He could feel his Primarch fracturing. Not his body, but his soul. The warp around Magnus roiled, wings of fire flickering behind him like a reflection in disturbed water. Every time he deflected Russ's blade, he seemed less a man and more an echo, a pattern of energy trying to hold its shape. Russ roared and struck again, blade slamming into Magnus's chest. The Primarch staggered, golden ichor spilling from the wound. He fell to one knee, hand pressed to the crack in his flesh. Through the pain, he felt something break. Not just his body, but a seal deep within him, a door he had always kept closed. Behind it waited power, vast and coiled, whispering his name. He looked up at Russ, tears of molten gold streaking his cheek. "Brother," he whispered, "please, don't make me." Russ raised his blade for the final stroke. "It's already made." Magnus exhaled. The whisper behind the door became a roar. The seal broke. Warp light erupted from him in a pillar, crimson and gold, shattering what remained of the plaza. Soldiers on both sides were hurled back. Sisters clutched their heads as null fields collapsed. The air itself bent, colors inverting, sound twisting. Magnus rose from his knees, taller, wings of fire unfurling from his back. His eye blazed like a miniature sun. He caught Russ's descending blade with one hand and held it effortlessly. Russ's eyes widened, but he did not step back. "So, this is what you've chosen." Magnus's voice was layered now, echoing as if spoken from a cavern. "I didn't choose. You forced me." He flung Russ backward with a sweep of his arm. The Wolf Lord crashed through a shattered column, sending shards of glass spinning. Magnus took a step forward, the ground cracking beneath him. Power coiled around his fingers, yearning to be unleashed. He could feel Prospero beneath him, its foundations trembling, its wards splintering, its soul screaming. He and the city were reflections of each other, both breaking under pressure. Through the warp, he sensed the Emperor one last time. Not a voice, not an image, but the feeling of a door closing, light fading beyond reach. He has turned away, Magnus thought. He will not forgive. That knowledge hollowed him, even as it filled him with power. Russ staggered to his feet, frostblade raised. Around them the battle paused, space wolves and thousand suns alike, frozen by the sight of their primarchs transformed. In that moment, everything seemed suspended. The crackle of fires, the drip of molten glass, the psychic hum of a world dying. Half light, half shadow, the eclipse complete. Magnus lowered his hand. "Go," he said softly. "Take your warriors and leave. I will bear the guilt." Russ's jaw clenched. "I can't." "Orders are orders." Magnus's wings flared. "Then we finish it." They met again in a blur of frost and flame. Each clash sent shockwaves through the city. Towers collapsed like brittle bones. Canals boiled. The sky split, warp storms bleeding through. With every strike, Magnus felt the pieces of himself scattering. Scholar, son, savant, until only the echo remained, a shape of power bound by regret. At last, Russ drove his blade into Magnus's side. The Primarch gasped, gripping the weapon with both hands. Warp light surged, enveloping them both. For a heartbeat they stood locked, eyes meeting across centuries of brotherhood. Then Magnus wrenched free and staggered back, wings flickering. He looked around. Prospero burned, its glass towers melted into black spires. Psychic screams reverberated like breaking crystal. He felt the last of the city's great wards give way, with a sound like cracking ice. Power rushed upward through the fissures, pouring into him, through him, beyond him. He saw visions, dust-filled armor, a crimson planet in the warp, himself as something more and less than human. He turned his face to the sky. "Father," he whispered, but the word vanished into the storm. Russ lowered his blade slightly, breathing hard. It didn't have to be this way. Magnus gave a bitter laugh, the sound like shattering glass. It always had to be this way. He spread his wings, warp light streaming from his wounds. Around him, Prospero shuddered, a reflection of his own fracture. Bonds between brothers had broken, seals had shattered. Whatever came next would not be undone. The narrator's voice softens, carrying the weight of inevitability. This is the breaking of the seal. Not only the wards of Prospero, not only the power within Magnus, but the bonds of loyalty, of love, of hope. Half light, half shadow. Two brothers locked in an eclipse. The Emperor's gaze turned away. The city's soul unraveled, and in the center stood Magnus the Red, no longer simply a son, no longer simply a scholar, but a fracture given form. Above, the sky collapsed into fire. Below, the glass city dissolved into dust. And at the heart of it, Magnus whispered a final word, whether to Russ, to his father, or to himself no one could tell, and stepped fully into destiny. The battle for Prospero had slowed to a kind of nightmare drift, a storm's eye where ash fell like black snow and time seemed to stretch. Glass towers lay toppled across the canals, their fragments glittering like frozen stars. Fires burned with a strange quietness, the flames pale and thin under the psychic silence the sisters had left behind. In this ruined city, Ahriman moved like a shadow, his crimson armor dulled by soot, his thoughts heavy as stone. He stepped over the body of a fallen brother and into what had been a hall of learning. Its roof was gone, the sky above a churning veil of smoke and warp light. Shelves had collapsed into heaps of splintered wood and cracked thought stones. Ahriman knelt beside a wounded sergeant, whispering a healing incantation that guttered before leaving his lips. The sisters' null field had been here. Its echo still gnawed at the warp. The sergeant's breath rattled and ceased. Ahriman closed the man's eyes and stood. He was not alone. Around him, a knot of surviving captains gathered, their faces masked by grime but their eyes burning. Phosis Takar leaned on his axe, armor scored by frost claws. Hathor Mart carried a memory stone cradled like a child. Others clutched weapons, scrolls, or nothing at all. They looked to Ahriman now, not because of rank, but because he was the only one still moving with purpose. He led them into a sheltered atrium where a cracked fountain trickled warp-tainted water. They formed a circle without speaking. The air smelled of burnt parchment and ozone. Overhead, the warp's color shifted crimson for a heartbeat, as if echoing the planet's own blood. Ahriman raised his head. "We cannot stay here," he said. Phosis's voice was rough. "We cannot leave either. The wolves hunt every street. The sisters have silenced the sky. We are trapped, not all of us," Hathor Mart murmured. "Some ships remain hidden." "And go where?" another captain demanded. "The Imperium has named us sorcerers and traitors. Our father has become something else." They all fell silent at that. Ahriman felt their minds brush his, cautious, questioning. They had seen Magnus rise on wings of fire. They had felt the surge of power that shattered Prospero's wards. They had watched their Primarch duel Russ, not as a brother, but as a force of the warp itself, victim or architect. Their thoughts swirled with that question like a whirlpool. Ahriman clasped his hands behind his back. "He tried to save us," he said quietly. "Did he?" Phosis's eyes were hard. "Or did he doom us when he defied the edict? When he warned terror and cracked its wards? When he stayed his hand until it was too late? He warned terror of Horus's betrayal." Ahriman snapped. "He acted from loyalty." "Loyalty to whom?" Hathor Mart asked softly. "To the Emperor? To us? Or to his own vision?" Ahriman looked away. Through a gap in the shattered wall, he could see the city's ruins stretching to the horizon, canals boiling under warp light, statues crumbling like salt. In the distance, the Space Wolves' banners moved through smoke, grey shapes stalking the last pockets of resistance. Overhead, crimson ripples licked across the sky, faint and rhythmic like a heartbeat. A prophecy whispered at the edge of his mind. A crimson planet, a great change. Suns turned to dust. He spoke without turning. "We are not finished. We are still the 1,000 suns. We will endure." Phosis barked a bitter laugh. "Endure? Look around you. Our city is ash. Our brothers are dead or dust. Our Primarch is... We don't even know what he is." "He is still our father," Ahriman said. Hathor Mart's voice was quiet but steady. "Then speak to him. Plead with him. If he is still Magnus, he will listen. If he is not..." He left the sentence unfinished. Ahriman turned back to them. "I will find him," he said. "I will bring him word of what remains. But you must gather the survivors. Prepare them. There will be a time when what we decide now matters more than any battle we have fought." Phosis frowned. "Prepare them for what?" Ahriman hesitated. In his dreams, he had seen a ritual of dust and fire, a spell to preserve minds at any cost. He had not told anyone, not yet. "For change," he said at last. "For a choice we may have to make." They did not press him. Perhaps they already sensed the shape of it. Perhaps they were too tired. One by one, they bowed their heads. Ahriman felt their loyalty brush his mind like a cold wind. Not absolute, not blind, but still there. He left the atrium and walked alone through the ruined city. Ash drifted like snow. Psychic echoes clung to walls. Laughter, chants, the scratch of quills, fading as he passed. He came to a plaza where children had once practiced telepathy. The crystal orbs lay shattered in the dust. He bent and picked up a fragment. It reflected not his face, but a crimson sky bleeding into darkness. He closed his fist and it crumbled. He thought of Magnus, teacher, father, Primarch, standing above them all with wings of fire. He thought of whispered prophecies, of the crimson planet in the warp, of a great change that would turn bodies to dust but preserve minds. A terrible idea, and yet, what else remained? Loyalty to a leader who had doomed them, or loyalty to the Legion's survival, even at a cost no one could yet name? He walked on. In the distance, he felt Magnus's presence, a beacon of power flickering like a dying star. He followed it to a collapsed temple where warp light spilled through cracks in the roof. Magnus sat on the steps, head bowed, wings folded like a shroud. His crimson skin was dulled, his eye a dim ember. Around him the air trembled with unshed power. Ahriman stopped at the edge of the courtyard. For a moment he saw not a Primarch, but a man hollowed by regret. "Father," he said softly. Magnus raised his head. "You should not be here." "Someone must," Ahriman replied. He approached slowly. "We are gathering survivors. They are afraid. They don't know what you are anymore." Magnus's mouth twisted. "Neither do I." Ahriman knelt before him. "They still look to you. Tell me you have a plan. Tell me we are not only ashes waiting for the wind." Magnus closed his eye. "I tried to save them. All of you. My warning tore open what it was meant to protect. My restraint invited the wolves. My power destroyed what remained. Tell me, Ahriman, how does a man lead when every choice is betrayal?" Ahriman's voice trembled but did not break. "By choosing anyway." Magnus opened his eye, and for a heartbeat, Ahriman glimpsed the teacher he had known. Patient, curious, fierce. Then the moment passed, and only the crimson giant remained. "You are still my son," Magnus said, "but there are truths even you cannot bear." "Then share the burden," Ahriman whispered. Magnus looked away. "Go. Save who you can. I will hold the wolves at bay." Ahriman stood slowly. He wanted to protest, to demand, but the words died. He saw the fracture running through Magnus like a fault line through stone. He saw the reflection of Prospero itself, once whole, now breaking, still beautiful even in ruin. Loyalty to a leader who might have doomed them. Loyalty to a father who might already be lost. He bowed his head. "We will be ready," he said. Magnus did not answer. Back in the atrium, Phocis and Hethor Mart were organizing what remained. Injured brothers, salvaged memory stones, a few ships hidden in warp shadow. Ahriman returned, face unreadable. "He will fight," he said. "We will gather." Hathor Mart looked up. "And after?" "After..." Ahriman's gaze drifted to the crimson sky. "After we will decide what loyalty means." The narrator's voice softens, carrying a note of foreboding. This is Ahriman's plea, not just to Magnus, but to history, to fate, to whatever listens. This is the Legion caught between love and survival, between victimhood and culpability. Whispers of a crimson planet and a great change move like currents under ash. The choice has not yet been made, but the seed of the rubric stirs. Above them, the warp flickered red again, like a heartbeat. In the ruins of Prospero, Loyalty had become a question, and every question a prophecy. The skies above Prospero were no longer skies at all, but a wound in reality. Warp light poured down through fissures in the clouds, staining the glass ruins with crimson and sickly green. The last of the 1,000 suns gathered at the docks of Tizca, their once gleaming armor dulled by ash. Around them, the air hummed with the slow pulse of engines and the restless whisper of the warp. Ships waited like great iron birds with torn wings, their prows etched with hastily carved sigils of protection. Ahriman moved among the survivors, his boots crunching over glass. He guided squads aboard, clasping hands, murmuring mantras that faltered even as he spoke them. Every few paces he looked back at the city. Towers melted into black spires, canals steaming, statues toppled like gravestones. Smoke rose in thin threads, vanishing into the warp light above. Prospero no longer looked like a world, but like a memory evaporating. Magnus came last. He limped through the immaterial tide, his crimson skin dim to rust, wings of fire flickering like dying embers. The warp clung to him in veils, whispering names and futures. With every step, he felt the cost of his defiance like a weight in his chest. He had worn terror and torn its wards. He had tried to shield his sons and instead drawn the wolves. Now he was leading what remained of them into exile. Yet he still clung to a thin thread of hope, though he did not know if it was hope or delusion. The ships rose one by one, slipping into the veil. As their hulls breached the immaterium, storms of screaming souls closed around them, voices of the unquiet dead pressing against the shields like rain. The warp was a sea without surface or floor, currents of thought and hunger rolling in endless swells. Lightning flashed purple and green across infinite horizons. Shapes moved in the deeps, larger than ships, larger than worlds. Every soul aboard felt the pressure in their skulls, a weight like deep water. Ahriman stood on the bridge of the flagship, hands on the rail. He whispered litanies of navigation, sigils forming and dissolving in the air before him. Each time the sisters' silence echoed faintly in his memory, and his words faltered. He forced himself to continue. Behind him, warriors and scholars huddled in silence, eyes closed, trying to shut out the warp's whisper. Some wept, some stared blankly, some traced runes on their armor with trembling fingers. Magnus entered the bridge. His presence steadied the deck for a moment, the warp retreating like a tide. But his eye was dim, his movements heavy. He moved to the viewport and looked out at the immaterial storm. Threads of crimson mist wound through it like veins. In some, he glimpsed his sons, not as they were, but as they might become. Armor hollow, minds sealed in dust, bodies no more than shells. In others, he saw himself winged and immense, a figure of prophecy rather than choice. He closed his eye, but the visions clung to the inside of his skull. "Father," Ahriman said softly, the old words slipping out unbidden. "Where do we go?" Magnus's voice was low. "Away. For now, only away. Will the Imperium pursue us?" "Yes. And if we cannot run?" Magnus turned, the flicker of his wings casting broken light across the bridge. "Then we will endure. Or become something." That can Ahriman's throat tightened. He looked at the men and women behind him, warriors, scholars, children who had lost their homes, and felt the question rise again. Victim or architect? Could a father who had led them into ruin still lead them out? The ship plunged deeper into the warp. Outside, storms of screaming souls closed in, faces flickering across the void like torn banners. The Geller fields groaned. Runes etched on the hull flared and cracked. The warp pressed closer, curious, hungry. Whispers crept through the vents, promises of safety, of power, of transformation. Some of the crew shuddered and covered their ears, though the sound was not physical. Magnus spread his hands and murmured a counter-charm. Crimson light rippled outward, reinforcing the shields. For a heartbeat, the warp recoiled, leaving a pocket of calm. He swayed with the effort. Ahriman stepped forward to steady him, but stopped when he saw the look in his eye. Not anger, not despair, but calculation. "You're still fighting it," Ahriman said. Magnus's mouth twitched. "As long as I can." "What do you see?" "Too many futures. None I would choose. Yet one keeps returning." He closed his eye, and in the warp, a crimson planet flickered, its surface cracked and bleeding light. A place of exile. A place of dust. Ahriman's voice dropped. "A place to preserve us." Magnus did not answer. He turned back to the viewport. The warp churned like a sea in storm, colors bleeding into one another. He thought of Prospero's canals, of children practicing telepathy, of his brothers debating in the Hall of Mirrors. All gone now, carried into memory. Only this storm remained. Behind him, murmurs rose among the survivors. Some whispered prayers to the Emperor still, though their words felt brittle. Others whispered new names. A few spoke of rituals to preserve their gifts, to anchor their minds even if their bodies failed. Ahriman listened, heart heavy. He had begun to think of such a ritual himself, a rubric, a safeguard, but had not yet dared to voice it. Magnus felt those thoughts too. His wings flickered, shedding sparks. "Do not," he said without turning. Ahriman's breath caught. "Do not what?" "Do not make plans you cannot bear to enact." Ahriman looked at the deck. If survival is treachery, then treachery may be all we have left. Magnus turned then, eye burning faintly. "I will not lose you as well." "You may not have a choice," Ahriman whispered. The ship shuddered as a warp current struck it, hurling crew against bulkheads. Runes flared and died. For a moment the shields thinned and screaming faces pressed against the hull, mouths open in silent sound. Magnus raised both hands and poured power outward, crimson light filling the bridge. The warp receded, leaving only echoes. He sagged, wings dimming. Ahriman moved to his side and caught his arm. "How long can you hold it?" Magnus's voice was barely audible. "As long as it takes." They stood together at the viewport. Outside, the warp boiled, but a faint path of calmer currents opened ahead, lit by distant crimson glow. Magnus stared at it, something like hope flickering in his eye. Perhaps there was still a way to preserve his sons. Perhaps dust was not the end, but a beginning. The narrator's voice slows, heavy as ash drifting on water. This is the Ashen Exodus, a legion leaving its home not in triumph, but in ruin, carried into storms of screaming souls. This is Magnus limping through immaterial tides, weighing the cost of his defiance, glimpsing destinies of dust, yet still clutching hope. This is Ahriman beside him, thinking of rituals he dares not speak, loyalty and survival knotted into one. The ships drift on, their hulls streaked with warp light, their holds heavy with silence, heading toward a crimson future no one can yet name. The ships of the 1,000 suns drifted in the warp like embers on a black tide, their engines humming with exhausted litanies. Within each vessel, corridors once bright with psychic sigils had dimmed to ash-colored walls, their runes cracked or flickering. The survivors moved quietly, speaking in whispers, minds wrapped in veils of self-preservation. In every chamber, the air smelled faintly of burnt parchment, as though Prospero's libraries had been carried into exile and set alight again. Magnus walked alone through the flagship's upper decks. His crimson skin had dulled to iron rust, his wings little more than tattered fire trailing behind him. Each step echoed like a tolling bell. He had tried to hold back the warp from his sons. Now it clung to him, murmuring its promises with every breath. The cost of his defiance lay heavy on his chest. Yet still he moved forward, because the only alternative was to stop, and stopping would be to drown. He entered a chamber that had once been a meditation hall, but now looked like a cold cathedral carved from memory. Columns rose like petrified flames, each one etched with fragments of Prospero's skyline. Balconies, canals, statues, frozen in pale relief. Above, a ceiling of black crystal showed nothing of the warp outside, only a faint inner glow like embers beneath ash. Here his captains waited, a dwindling circle of warriors and scholars who still called him father, though their voices faltered on the word. Ahriman stood near the center, hood lowered, eyes shadowed. Phocis Takar leaned on his axe, armor dented but polished, as if discipline alone could hold him together. Hathor Ma'at held a memory stone that pulsed faintly with stolen knowledge. Others filled the ring, some gaunt with exhaustion, some still bleeding from wounds that would not heal. Their faces were maps of ruin and endurance. Magnus descended the steps into their midst. The hall felt colder than space. His voice, when he spoke, was low but clear. "You know why I have called you?" Ahriman answered first. "Because we are dying." Phosis's voice followed, rough. "Because we have no home. Because the warp closes in, and we have nothing left." Hathor Ma'at's gaze flickered. "Because you have seen something, my lord. Something you have not yet told us." Magnus closed his eye for a moment. When he opened it, the ember within glowed faintly brighter. "I have seen futures," he said. "I have seen our legions scatter to dust, our minds lost to the warp, our names forgotten. I have seen a crimson planet where our power survives but our souls do not. And I have seen a path, terrible and binding, by which we might endure." Murmurs stirred the circle. Ahriman's voice cut through them. "What path?" Magnus raised his hand. Warp light flickered across the carved columns, turning the reliefs of Prospero's skyline into shifting visions. "There are powers older than the Imperium, older than the warp itself as we know it. I sought to master them once. I refused their bargains. But now—" He hesitated, the pause longer than a breath. "Now I will bargain." Phosis's gauntlet creaked. "With what price?" "With ourselves," Magnus said. "With what we are." The silence deepened. Even the warp's murmur faded at the edge of hearing. Ahriman's expression was unreadable. "You would bind us," he said slowly. "Bind the 1,000 suns to the very powers we have always resisted." "I would preserve you," Magnus replied. "Even at the cost of chains. Even at the cost of dust." Phocis stepped forward, fury flashing in his aura. "You would make us slaves to demons." Magnus's eye blazed. "No, I would make us something the warp cannot erase. Not slaves, not dust. Something—" Enduring, Ahriman looked down at his hands. He remembered his own whispered thoughts. The rubric forming in secret, the idea of sealing minds within shells. He had not dared to speak it. Now his father was offering a darker mirror of that same thought. "You think this will save us," he murmured. "I know nothing will save us unchanged," Magnus said. "But I will not watch you vanish." He turned, gesturing. The columns brightened, revealing not only memories but rituals etched between them. Sigils like doors, runes like veins. "Here," he said. "I have built a cathedral of thought. Each pillar is a memory of Prospero. Each arch is a gate into power. We will perform the rite here. Phocis backed away. This is madness. Magnus faced him. Madness was believing obedience would spare us. Madness was silence. This is survival. Ahriman stepped closer. And what becomes of us after? Magnus's wings flickered like torn banners. We become what we must. The captains exchanged glances. Some looked away, ashamed. Some stared at Magnus with mingled awe and dread. Loyalty had become a question with no safe answer. Yet in their hearts burned a single desire, not to vanish. That desire tilted them toward ascent, even as it repelled them. Magnus knelt in the center of the hall. The warp gathered around him, a slow spiral of crimson and gold. He began to trace runes on the floor with his clawed fingertips, each one sparking like flint. The air thickened, smelling of iron and old paper. He spoke no words, only thoughts shaped into chords. The columns shivered, the ceiling darkened. The reliefs of Prospero's skyline flickered into shadows, a cathedral of memory becoming a cathedral of pact. Ahriman watched, heart pounding. He saw his father not as a god, but as a desperate man weaving chains. He wanted to stop him, to shout, but the warp held his tongue. Instead, he stepped into the circle and placed his hand on Magnus's shoulder. "If this is what you choose," he said, "then I will bear it with you." Magnus looked up, and for an instant his eyes softened. "My son," he whispered, "I wanted to spare you this." Phocis hesitated, then slammed his axe haft to the floor. "I swore an oath," Hegkis muttered. "Even now." One by one, the captains joined the circle, some with resolve, some with resignation, all with the same quiet desperation. The warp closed around them like a tide. Sigils flared on the floor, pillars glowing like frozen flames. Shadows moved at the edges of the hall, shapes without names, watching. Magnus raised his hands. "Witness," he said to those shadows. "Witness our bargain. We will give what we must to endure." The warp roared in answer, not as a voice, but as a vast intake of breath. Power coiled through the hall, pressing against flesh and thought alike. Each man felt a piece of himself slip like sand through fingers. Memory blurred, then sharpened. Prospero's skyline flickered overhead, balconies, canals, children at play, before dissolving into ash. In its place appeared a crimson planet, its surface cracked and bleeding light. Magnus swayed but held the vision. "This will be our refuge," he whispered. "Our prison. Our future." Ahriman's heart clenched. He saw minds sealed in armor, bodies turned to dust. He saw power without freedom, endurance without life. Yet even as dread filled him, a spark of grim resolve flickered. If this was the price, then he would shape it, refine it, make it something that could hold them until a better future came. The narrator's voice slows, like ash settling in water. "This is the pact of dust, Magnus, shattered but unbowed, bargaining in desperation. A cathedral of thought becomes a cathedral of ritual, each pillar a memory of Prospero, each arch a gate into power. The sons of Prospero stand in a circle of choice, loyalty bending toward chains, hope flickering into something harder. In the warp shadows, lean closer, listening. Magnus closes his eye and seals the runes. The crimson planet glows above them like a heart. Around them the warp presses inward, whispering promises, binding threads. They have taken the path. Whether salvation or damnation, no one can yet tell. The crimson planet hung suspended in the warp, like a heart torn from a body, its surface cracked by glowing fissures that pulsed with sorcerous tides. Here the 1,000 suns had built their refuge of dust and thought. a floating labyrinth of obsidian ziggurats and windless courtyards. No birds flew in its skies. No oceans broke on its shores. The air shimmered with power, yet tasted of ash. Every tower was a monument to what they had lost, every corridor an echo of Prospero's vanished streets. Ahriman stood at the center of a great amphitheater carved into the planet's crust. Around him, his brothers formed concentric rings, their armor bright with sigils, their minds humming with expectation and dread. Above them, the sky was a bruised tapestry of red and violet, stars swirling like sparks. Between the cracks of the planet's skin, warp light rose in slow coils, flickering against the black stone like candle flames seen underwater. He had spent nights, if nights could be, measured in this place, perfecting the rubric. It was more than a spell. It was a last confession, a desperate geometry of hope and control. He told himself it would save them from the creeping mutations the warp inflicted on their flesh. He told himself it would preserve their minds, anchor their souls, keep their gifts from devouring them. But beneath those reasons lay a single plea, not to lose everything, not to watch his legion vanish one by one, not to stand helpless as Prospero had burned. Magnus watched from a raised dais, a crimson giant draped in tattered robes, his wings folded like a storm at rest. In his single eye burned a complex light, grief, pride, and something colder. He had agreed to this ritual reluctantly, warning of dangers Ahriman would not name. But he had not stopped it. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps some part of him hoped the rubric would do what his bargains had not. Ahriman raised his staff. The amphitheater's runes flared, tracing spirals of fire across the stone. The warp thickened, pressing on their armor, tasting their thoughts. He began to speak, not words, but shapes of thought that slotted into one another like gears. Each phrase drew a breath from the planet's cracks. Each breath became a wind. Armor creaked. The crimson sky darkened. At first it felt like a scent. Power lifted them, a tide carrying ships. Brothers' minds interlocked like a choir, voices rising in harmonic chord. Sigils danced above their heads, weaving a canopy of light. In that moment, Ahriman glimpsed a future where their bodies held steady, their gifts disciplined, their minds intact. He poured himself into that vision, pushing doubt aside. Then the unraveling began. It started as a tremor in the song, a note falling flat. One brother gasped and dropped his staff, armor clanging. Another clutched his helm. The warp light that had coiled so smoothly began to twist, threads snapping, colors bleeding into one another. Ahriman felt it slip, tried to adjust, but the geometry shifted like quicksand. He saw a warrior across the circle stiffen. Sigils burned off his armor like paper. His scream came not from his mouth, but from his mind, then stopped abruptly as his body collapsed inward, leaving the armor upright but empty. A swirl of dust rose from within, drifted upward, and dissolved into the warp. The armor clattered, a hollow shell. More voices fell silent. Psychic auras winked out one by one, like candles snuffed in a cathedral. Brothers reached for each other, only to find gauntlets grasping emptiness. Dust spiraled into the air, soft as ash from burned books. The amphitheater filled with a low hiss, like pages turning too fast. Ahriman's staff shook in his hands. "No," he whispered, but the spell continued, vast and inexorable. Magnus rose slowly from the dais. The warp roared around him, wings spreading like a storm. He saw his sons unravel, saw ornate armor clatter empty, saw minds he had nurtured for centuries vanish into dust. He had thought he had already lost everything, But this was loss transfigured. He reached out, trying to halt the ritual, but his own bargains bound him. Power poured through his hands, yet it could not catch what was slipping away. Ahriman turned, eyes wide. "Father, help me!" Magnus descended the steps, each footfall shaking the stone. "You should have listened," he said, voice heavy as a bell. "You should have stopped." "I wanted to save them," Ahriman cried. You wanted control," Magnus thundered. His wings flared, casting crimson light across the dying amphitheater. Yet even as he spoke, another brother's soul burned out, leaving only a suit of armor slumping to its knees, gauntlets resting on an invisible book. The warp howled. Dust rose in pillars, whirling around the survivors like ghosts. The sky cracked open, showing glimpses of Prospero's ruin, of feathers burning, of a red sea boiling. Ahriman dropped to his knees, staff falling. He felt the rubric complete itself, a circle closing. Those few who still stood gasped as their mutations burned away, their minds hardening like stone. They would not mutate now. They would not change. But neither would they ever be free. Around them, rows of empty suits of armor knelt, silent guardians with no souls, their dust drifting in faint currents. Magnus stopped at the center of the amphitheater, his eye dimmed to an ember. "Look at what you have done," he said softly. Ahriman bowed his head. "I tried to save us." Magnus closed his eye. "And you have made us hollow." Silence settled over the crimson planet. Only the hiss of drifting dust remained. The amphitheater's runes faded to black. Above, the sky's bruised colors steadied, as if the warp itself were holding its breath. The 1,000 suns had been remade, some as living sorcerers locked in unchanging bodies, most as empty shells of armor filled with dust. Magnus raised his wings. They no longer felt like symbols of power, but of exile. He looked over the rows of hollow suits, over the few living faces left, and felt himself fracture further. Once he had sought to master the warp. Now he was bound to it by the same chains as his sons. He was a crimson giant in more ways than one, vast in power, hollowed by loss, forever marked. The narrator's voice slows, heavy as ash settling after fire. This is the rubric unfolding. Not a single spell, but a slow unraveling of identity. Ornate armor clatters empty. Psychic voices fall silent. Souls turn to dust. And Magnus, standing amid it all, watches his legion become a hollow echo of itself. He has preserved them, but at a cost no one can name. This is not salvation. This is endurance turned to stone. Magnus lowered his head. Dust drifted past his face, catching on the ember of his eye. He whispered a word too soft for anyone to hear. Perhaps apology, perhaps promise. Above, the crimson sky rolled, on, indifferent. Below, the hollow legion waited, silent and still, like statues around a broken god. The eye of terror stretched around them like a wound in the universe, a churning expanse of violet storms and bleeding stars. From its heart, the planet of the sorcerers rose, as if conjured from the imagination of a mad god. Towers of glass and obsidian spiraled impossibly, reflecting the endless chaos beyond. Stormlight flickered across streets paved with memory. Pathways lined by statues of the living turned to dust and stone, their eyes forever open, yet empty, their faces echoing the last thought before the rubric claimed them. Magnus walked through this city of shadows, each step resonating across the silent plazas. The air shimmered with warp light, carrying a faint scent of ash and old incense, as if the planet itself remembered Prospero and the lives it had consumed. Palaces rose like impossible geometries, mirrors of thought cast into solid form, their facades fracturing reality. Every wall was a prism, every corridor a dream rendered permanent, yet none of it brought warmth. Immortality had a chill to it, a quiet that pressed against the bones of the living. He paused before a plaza where dozens of his sons stood, or seemed to. Their bodies glimmered crimson, frozen in the act of thought or spellcasting. Hands extended, lips parted in silent incantation. Ahriman moved among them, carefully tending those still capable of will, his staff tracing sigils in the thick air. The rubric had preserved, yes, but it had also imprisoned. Minds that once soared through the warp now hovered like birds caught behind glass, aware, frustrated, forever limited. Magnus felt each presence like a phantom tug at his soul, and each tug left him hollower. In the high towers, libraries stacked with psychic tomes spiraled into the clouds of warp storms. Magnus ascended one of these towers, his crimson wings folding against his back like tired sails. From this height, the city sprawled endlessly, a dream of stone and thought anchored in nightmare. He could see the distant horizon of screaming storms, the eye's chaos reflected in every spire. Here, in this mirrored eternity, he understood the cost of survival. The sons he had loved, the worlds they had known, the laughter and tears, they were gone. Only echoes remained. Yet amidst the stillness, life persisted in strange forms. The few who retained consciousness moved carefully, whispering words of instruction or consolation to those who could still respond. Spells were woven with the precision of a clockmaker, gestures made to coax the minds of frozen brothers into stability. Ahriman whispered advice, counsel, warnings. Magnus's own hand hovered over the orb of the planet's heart, feeling the tremors of thought as it pulsed like a slow, cruel heartbeat. He wandered further, through streets where statues of his sons were posed mid-motion. A librarian reaching for a book that would never be held, a warrior casting a spell that would never ignite, a child folding wings of fire that would never take flight. Each was a monument to what had been and what could not be again. Magnus pressed his palm to a frozen librarian's face. The skin was cold and smooth. The mind, though aware, could not respond. Here was the living death of devotion, the stasis of love unfulfilled, and Magnus felt the weight of it press against his chest. At the city's core rose the throne of shards, a crystalline structure that refracted every spark of warp light into a spectrum of fire and sorrow. It was at once throne, lighthouse, and prison. Magnus ascended the steps, each footfall echoing in a hollow canyon of psychic energy. From here, he could watch over his sons, over the city, over the mirrored towers that stretched endlessly. He could see the storms of the eye swirling, indifferent to the fate of mortals or immortals alike. The throne was a lattice of fractured glass, veins of warp light coursing through it like blood through crystal arteries. He lowered himself into it, feeling the pulse of the planet beneath him, the heartbeat of his legion around him. Ahriman knelt beside the throne, eyes downcast, hands folded. The survivors whispered questions about the future, about purpose, about what it meant to endure when so much had been lost. Magnus's own thoughts were heavy, looping endlessly. How could they rebuild? How could they find meaning in a city of immobile suns, of frozen joy, of perpetual mourning? He remembered Prospero, its skies torn asunder, the fires, the loss, the laughter of his sons echoing through halls of glass. Now, here in the eye, every tower a reflection of that memory, every frozen brother a shard of the past. He felt the full scope of his choices. Immortality had been granted, but it was not freedom. Power had been preserved, but at the cost of vitality, spontaneity, and the living warmth of mind and flesh. The throne of shards was magnificent, yes, but it was a monument to endurance turned cruel. Magnus rose from the throne, wings unfurling in slow arcs. He walked among the statues again, touching a shoulder here, a helm there, feeling the faint pulse of thought beneath every shell. They were preserved, yes, but at a cost no one could name, a cost he carried in every feather, every wing, every pulse of his own crimson body. He whispered to them, words carried on winds that would not respond. Apologies, promises, perhaps curses, perhaps only echoes. He climbed higher, to the uppermost terrace of the city, and looked outward at the eye. The storms swirled with indifferent grandeur. The crimson planet below pulsed like a wounded heart, and the city of thought reflected every color of sorrow and memory. Magnus understood fully now. This was the legacy of the thousand suns. Immortal, yes, unbroken in body, unyielding in power, but forever bound to the ruins of their own choices, trapped in the silence of preservation. The narrator's voice softens here, gentle as a drifting star. This is the throne of shards. Not a throne of triumph, but a seat of endurance and remembrance. A city of thought, a legion of echoes, a father watching over sons who can never again run, laugh, or fall. In their stillness, there is beauty, and in that beauty, infinite sorrow. Magnus sits, wings folded, heart heavy, yet unbowed. The planet waits, the storms wait, and the thousand suns endure, a reflection of power and loss entwined, eternal and silent. The city below shimmered like a broken jewel, every tower a fractured echo of hope and ruin. Magnus stood atop the highest terrace of the throne of shards, the wind of the warp tugging at his crimson cloak and the edges of his wings. The storms beyond the eye writhed with a strange sentience, as if curious observers were peering into his thoughts. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine the city as it once had been, streets alive with laughter, towers sparkling with psychic light, sons and brothers walking freely, their minds alight with possibility. That world had died in fire, in obedience, in betrayal, and now only shadows remained to haunt him. A mirror lay before him, a shard plucked from the crystalline towers, polished to impossible clarity. But when he gazed into it, there was no reflection, no living, breathing Magnus, no wings stretched wide in pride or battle, only an absence, a void where identity should have been, a hollow glass that absorbed his image and offered nothing in return. The air hummed around him, thick with psychic residue, and he felt it press against his mind like a tide of frozen memories. The thousand suns were silent echoes. The city was a museum of lost lives. And he, their father, was the lone witness to a grandeur that had become emptiness. Rivals stirred in the streets below. Though most of the legion were frozen by the rubric, a few retained fragile consciousness, whispering in cautious cadence. Their eyes, lit by sparks of thought, followed Magnus, questioning, judging, waiting. He had once believed that knowledge could protect, that foresight could guide, that loyalty and power could coexist without fracture. Those illusions were gone now, shattered into fragments more numerous than the shards of the city itself. Ahriman approached quietly, his staff tapping against the terrace stone. The exiled scholar's eyes carried the weight of disobedience, a spark that Magnus both admired and feared. Words were unnecessary between them. The air was thick with histories, with betrayals, with the silent acknowledgement of choices that could never be undone. Magnus had always known that the cost of forbidden knowledge was high, yet seeing it laid bare in this city of suspended souls brought a new understanding. Mastery had become isolation, and power had become loneliness. Magnus began, then faltered. The syllable hung in the warp wind and dissolved. What could he say? What words could capture the ache of immortality when every heartbeat was a reminder of absence? Ahriman did not answer, only inclining his head slightly, a gesture heavy with both respect and accusation. The silence stretched, a palpable tension that mirrored the still streets, the frozen suns, the unyielding spires. The mirror before Magnus began to ripple, subtle at first, like water stirred by a distant wind. In it, fragments of faces appeared. A young librarian mid-gesture, a warrior with fire in his hands, a child with wings that never touched the sky. They were not alive, not in the way living flesh could laugh or cry, but they were present in the faint pulse of memory that clung to the city. Magnus's hand hovered above the glass, trembling. He could feel the threads of the past woven into the present, and yet they offered nothing but reflection without substance. A whisper echoed across the terrace, soft as a feather brushing stone. "Father," it said, yet no voice was there. The sound was an artifact of thought, a remnant of what had been and could no longer be. Magnus's chest tightened. The years of guidance, protection, and mentorship pressed upon him, reminding him of every vow made and every life lost. He had striven to teach, to shield, to elevate, but in the pursuit of knowledge and survival, he had become a godless king, a sovereign of silence. The rubric had taken his sons, the Imperium had taken his faith, and the warp had taken his certainty. Rivals and lingering conscious brothers observed him now with quiet hostility. Some bore grievances from battles that had passed. Others resented the silence that the rubric had imposed upon their kin. Even Ahriman, whose loyalty had once been unshakable, now carried the weight of exile, a living challenge to Magnus's authority. And Magnus, gazing into the mirror, understood fully. His reign was no longer of guidance, but of isolation, a throne built upon ash, a city of thought where loyalty had no voice. He remembered the faces of the space wolves, the roar of Fenrisian fury, the fire that had reduced Prospero to cinders, memories of obedience and rebellion intertwined in a tapestry of regret. Every decision, every act of defiance, every whisper to the emperor had led him here, to a throne without reflection, to a city without warmth, to sons who could not speak, to a father who had never truly understood him. And yet, in the quiet folds of thought, he felt the faintest ember of resolve. He had survived. He had endured. He remained Magnus, if only in the echo of thought and the crimson glow of being. The wind from the warp shifted, carrying with it the faint hum of the eye, the distant cries of the lost, and the subtle tremor of the impermanent world beyond. Magnus folded his wings, their crimson feathers brushing against his sides. He looked once more at the mirror, at the void that reflected nothing, and then closed his eyes. In that darkness, he did not see absence, but possibility. Perhaps this was not the end, he thought. Perhaps even in exile, even in silence, even in loss, a path remained. A path defined not by obedience or knowledge, but by endurance, by reflection, by the slow, deliberate shaping of destiny from shards of despair. Ahriman lingered nearby, waiting. Magnus spoke finally, voice soft but clear, carrying across the terrace, across the city, across the warped echo of eternity. We endure, we will endure, not as conquerors, not as saviors, not as sons of a father who could not see them, but as survivors, as custodians of thought, as the architects of their own solemn kingdom. The mirror shimmered once more, and for the briefest moment, Magnus's own form seemed to ripple within it, a fleeting glimpse of a king restored, not in flesh or power, but in purpose. Below, the city pulsed faintly, towers alive with the memory of movement, streets echoing with silent laughter, statues poised mid-action, the wind of the warp carrying whispers of hope through the spires. Magnus breathed in, the stormlight reflecting in his eyes, and felt, for the first time since Prospero burned, the quiet weight of peace, or at least the semblance of it. He would remain on this throne of shards, a solitary king amid echoes, yet he would watch and remember and endure. And though the mirror offered no reflection, Magnus finally understood that he did not need one. He had become the sum of memory, of sacrifice, of love and loss and endurance, a sorcerer king without subjects, a father without sons, a custodian of thought in a city of eternal echoes, yet whole in the only way that truly mattered. The eye of terror churned around him, indifferent yet aware. Storms of chaos raged, flames and psychic winds twisting the horizon, but Magnus, standing on his terrace, folded into the quiet, the slow, patient embrace of immortality. Here, he was alone, yet not abandoned. Here, he was eternal, yet not powerless. Here, he was Magnus, and in that knowledge, he found the smallest comfort the galaxy could offer. The eye of terror had quieted, at least for a moment. The storms that had raged over Prospero's ruins now lay like ash settling from a fire too vast to contain. Magnus walked among the scattered remnants of his son's armor, each piece a hollow echo of the life it once contained. The crimson glow of his own form mingled with the dying light of suns drifting across the warp, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the fractured ground. He moved slowly, deliberately, aware that every step resonated with the memories of what had been, and the cost of what he had chosen to preserve. Above him, stars faded and flared, flickering in the psychic winds like candles struggling against a draught. The galaxy beyond, vast and uncaring, shifted in indifferent rhythms, yet Magnus felt its subtle awareness, a quiet tremor acknowledging the tragedy that had unfolded on this forgotten world. The silence was absolute, punctuated only by the faint hum of psychic residue, the lingering whispers of sons who no longer spoke, of brothers who would never walk again, of a city that would never shine in life but remained immortal in memory. He paused before a cluster of armor that had once belonged to a young librarian, polished and gleaming before the rubric had claimed it. Now it was empty, a shell containing only the faintest trace of consciousness, a soul suspended between worlds. Magnus knelt, tracing the contours with a winged hand, and whispered the names of those he had failed, those he had loved, those he had been powerless to save. In the quiet, the warp seemed to lean closer, as if listening, as if weighing his grief against the enormity of the universe. The red planet, now distant and silent, reflected in the pools of psychic light scattered across the terrace. Magnus stared into its surface, seeing not the planet itself, but the reflection of all that had been lost and all that had been endured. He remembered Prospero at its height, the gleaming towers of glass and crystal, the winds of psychic energy that sang through the city streets, the laughter and pride of a legion who believed in him. Those images had once been a source of hope. Now they were ghosts, preserved only in the mind of the one who had survived to witness their ruin. The psychic winds tugged at him, gentle now, a lull after the storm. He moved among the silent remnants of the city, listening to the hollow echoes of footsteps and whispers of memory. Each sound was a reminder of mortality, even amid immortality, of the fragility of life, even in a world where time held no dominion. Magnus walked slowly, feeling the weight of endless years pressing upon his mind and soul. Knowledge had been his burden and his gift, yet it had delivered him here, alone, eternal, yet painfully human in his longing. He came to a terrace overlooking the warp sea, its surface rippling with crimson light, reflecting the dying suns and the scattered stars above. The water was calm, a deceptive mirror that hid the turbulence beneath. Magnus stared into it, seeing his own reflection, crimson and vast, yet hollow-eyed. A king without subjects, a father without sons, a scholar without peers. The image did not frighten him. It was a reminder. He had endured, and in endurance there was clarity. In survival, there was responsibility. In immortality, there was reflection. The armor around him remained silent, the hollow shells of those who had been his sons standing vigil against the eternal night. He passed each one, whispering apologies and affirmations. Promises he could no longer keep in the conventional sense, but could honor in memory and thought. The psychic residue of their minds responded faintly, not with gratitude or recognition, but with acknowledgement. A quiet bond that transcended flesh, transcended war, transcended even time itself. A final whisper of wind carried through the ruined city, rustling banners frozen mid-sway, scattering shards of crystal light across the terrace. Magnus spread his wings, not in flight but in reflection, letting them brush against the scattered remnants of history. The gesture was solemn, meditative, an act of homage to what had been, and a quiet acceptance of what was to come. He had no illusions of redemption, no fantasies of reunion, only the steady pulse of existence, the slow, deliberate rhythm of consciousness persisting against the vast indifference of the cosmos. Above him, the stars continued to fade and flare. The warp song had shifted to a minor cadence, soft and reflective, like the last notes of a long-forgotten hymn. Magnus closed his eyes, allowing the psychic harmonics to wash over him, to soothe and to remind him that even in silence there was voice, even in loss there was memory, even in ruin there was beauty. He felt the pull of infinite possibilities, the branching paths of what might have been and what could yet emerge. Yet he chose to remain, to watch, to endure, to remember. He spoke softly into the night, a solitary cadence echoing across the empty city, across the scarred plains of Prospero, across the warp sea and into the distant stars. All that lives is remembered, all that is lost endures in thought, and all that is eternal finds its place. The words were not for the galaxy, not for his sons, not even for Ahriman, who lingered silently at the edge of his awareness. They were for himself, a meditation, a ritual of closure, a final acknowledgement of the life he had lived and the empire he had lost. The red planet hung low on the horizon, a silent sentinel watching over the ruins of what had been and the faint beginnings of what might still arise. Magnus gazed at it long, allowing the crimson light to fill him, to bleed into his consciousness, to become a companion in the solitude of eternity. It was a reminder that all knowledge came with a cost, all power demanded sacrifice, and all love, even when unattainable, shaped the course of memory and destiny. From the far reaches of the warp, faint echoes of past voices drifted, some his sons, some strangers, some fragments of futures never realized. Magnus heard them not as pain, but as testament. Each echo was a life remembered, a story preserved, a pulse of continuity that defied the absolute silence around him. In this quiet exodus of sound and thought, he recognized a simple truth. Empires rise and fall, but consciousness endures. even in the smallest corners of the heart, even in the silent moments of the night, even in the meditation of a king who has survived the collapse of worlds. He turned from the terrace, letting the crimson glow wash over his form, and walked among the armor once more, passing hands over chest plates and pauldrons with a reverence born of memory. Each touch was a connection, a small act of guardianship, a reminder that while the sons of Prospero were no longer flesh and blood, their essence lingered, and he was their witness. Magnus would remain their sentinel, a custodian of thought and memory in a galaxy that seldom paused for reflection. The warp's light dimmed further, the stars over the eye settling into soft glimmers, like embers fading from a dying fire. Magnus paused at the edge of the city, gazing out at the unbroken expanse of crimson and gold, at the silent seas of thought and matter, at the quiet aftermath of a saga that had begun in pride and ended in solitude. Here, in this liminal space, he allowed himself a measure of peace, not joy, not triumph, but a steady, enduring awareness of existence itself. He turned his gaze back inward, toward the terraces, toward the shards of the city, toward the echoes of his sons. He could not restore them, could not reclaim the glory of Prospero, could not undo the choices that had led to this moment. But he could remember, he could endure, and he could reflect. And in that reflection lay a small, stubborn defiance. Life, thought, memory, these were not entirely lost. They persisted, quietly, eternally, in him. And so the red planet slept, bathed in the gentle afterglow of dying suns, the remnants of a city of thought and power frozen in meditation. Magnus walked among the silence, alone but not forsaken, eternal yet measured, and carried within him the weight of all that had been and all that was yet to come. The galaxy, vast and uncaring, continued its indifferent spin, yet in its midst a single figure bore witness to loss and endurance alike. Above, stars faded into the black of endless space, and the warp whispered its lullaby, soft and eternal. Below, the shattered city pulsed faintly, a heartbeat in the quiet, a memory of what had been, a promise of what might endure. Magnus paused, lifted his head to the silent heavens, and whispered once more, not to the galaxy, not to his sons, not to the cosmos itself, but to himself. All that is remembered persists. All that endures shall be witness. All that sleeps shall awaken in thought. The crimson seas stretched before him, quiet now, eternal, reflective. The red planet, Prospero's echo, Magnus himself, each a fragment of a story larger than any single life, larger than any empire, larger than any fleeting mortal ambition. And in that quiet, the saga of the thousand suns came to rest, suspended between memory and eternity, between loss and reflection, between the end of a world and the persistence of its legacy. The universe breathed around him, indifferent yet attentive. Magnus walked slowly, deliberately, into the gentle shadows of the city he had once loved and